Hello, welcome back to Food Entertainment. For our next review, I'll have the Mission Impossible 4K box set. Now it'll be 2000's Mission Impossible 2. Now first, I'm going to piss off some people here. Out of all the Mission Impossible films, this is probably the least liked one. A lot of people did not like this movie. Honestly, I love Mission Impossible 2. Granted, with that said, for a while when I was younger, I actually, agreed with everybody, because at the time what we had was a very thriller-driven, very espionage, very think tank movie with just a couple or maybe 3 good action set pieces and a little action thrown in there, but overall a story-driven movie as opposed to an action spectacular extravaganza film with, enough story that kind of makes it more like a James Bond movie. But that's kind of the point, because, and I believe I said this when I reviewed Mission Impossible 2 on regular Blu-ray a few years ago. This is probably the most James Bondish Mission Impossible film, and that is kind of what makes it so cool. It's because it kind of plays itself out a lot like a James Bond movie, as opposed to all the other films which kind of do some weird things when it comes to the films. Because let's face it, a whole lot of the Mission Impossible stories that are told throughout these movies are stolen from James Bond. I'm sorry, I probably said that before. It's been a long time since I reviewed these films. I don't typically watch every single video that I have created over and over again. Remember what I said. But if I know me back then, I know me now. I was probably said something about along these lines. If you watch the James Bond films, didn't you watch the Mission Impossible films? You can find similarities. Now, I'm not quite sure which James Bond movie I would say that this one's stealing from for the story plot of Mission Impossible 2, but there probably is one out there that is doing it from. But with that said, this is a really fun movie. It's a very, very fun film. And I can definitely say that if you have had bad thoughts about Mission Impossible 2, you really should go ahead and give it a revisit, because it's actually a pretty fun movie. I have no problems with Mission Impossible 2. I have no problems at all with Mission Impossible 2. Except for the fact that maybe if I did have a problem at all, it's probably this. It's just is sets itself up more as a action driven type piece film with a good enough story to follow, but a story that is not so espionage and not so thrilling as, say, the first film. But like I said when I reviewed the first film just moments ago, Mission Impossible 1 is the only real true espionage spy thriller movie in the Mission Impossible film series. Granted, all the films are spy films, but they concentrate more on being a octane action thrill ride and a lot less of a espionage movie. So I do not understand why people have a problem with Mission Impossible 2. Now let's go on to the plot synopsis. Tom Cruise returns to his role as Ethan Hunt in the second installment of Mission Impossible. This time, Ethan Hunt leads his IMF team on a mission to capture a deadly German virus before it is released by terrorists. His mission is made impossible due to the fact that he is not the only person after samples of the disease. He also must consist with a gang of international terrorists headed by a turned-bad former IMF agent who has already managed to steal the cure. Yeah, that's pretty much the plot of the film. So that definitely works. And, yeah, Now, what's really cool is the style of the film, and maybe that's where a lot of people have a problem with the film. Is maybe it's the style of the film. Maybe it's the fact that this film has like this Asian flavor to the style. But let me explain why. Um, Mission Impossible 2 was directed by basically who I would consider to be the Steven Spielberg of action movies, is a director, and that is the very own Asian action film director John Woo. He was responsible for Hard Target with Jean-Claude Van Damme, Black Jack with Dolph Lundgren, Hard Boiled with Mark Wahlberg, Wind Talkers with Nicolas Cage, as well as Face Off and Broken Arrow, in The Big Hit as well. If I haven't mentioned that one already. Sorry. I will correct myself. I got Hard Boiled mixed up with The Big Hit. The Big Hit is the Mark Wahlberg one. Hard Boiled is back in his Asian days with Chow Yun Fat, which he made a lot of films with, including The Killer and Once Upon a Time in Tokyo, I believe. So he's a real renowned international spectacular action film director, but his style definitely goes more towards the Asian tropes, and he kind of brought that flavor into this film. And in fact, one of his little tropes is always the double gun, and believe it or not, John Woo is actually the creator of bullet play. Bullet play would be used and perfected a bit more in the first Matrix movie in 1999. But the Matrix movie didn't create bullet play. John Woo created bullet play in Asia with films like The Killer and Hard Boiled. And yeah, it is used a lot in this film. It's used a lot in a lot of his films, whether it be Blackjack with Dolph Lundgren having two Berettas, or Jean-Claude Van Damme doing bullet play with his guns in Hard Target, or just using a 44 Magnum in slow motion and Broken Arrow, so on and so forth, for all the insane bullet play you have in Face Off, is one of his tropes. And maybe that's what throws people off about Mission Impossible 2, is that Asian flavor that John Woo, is the director of the film, brings. But honestly, I love John Woo films. I think he's one of the best and most overlooked action directors today. He wasn't overlooked in his prime, but that's probably why we don't see him anymore. Because after Wind Talkers, we just don't really talk about John Woo anymore. And that's unfortunate, because he's actually one of the better action directors. Alright, well, let's talk about quality. But first, a little trivia. Let's go ahead and talk a little trivia. There's a couple of interesting things to say about the actor who plays the villain, which is Scottish actor Dougray Scott, or Dougray Scott. He plays our villain in the film. It was Sean Andrews. Dougray Scott, Dougray Scott is the first choice we had for the character of Logan, aka the Wolverine, in the X-Men films. And believe it or not, if it weren't for Mission Impossible 2 hogging up his schedule, we would never have gotten Hugh Jackman in the X-Men movies. We would have gotten Dougray Scott as the Wolverine, not Hugh Jackman. So, there's something you can think about right there. If it weren't for Mission Impossible 2, we wouldn't have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. Now, even more interesting is, there's actually two main candidates for who should be James Bond in the next James Bond movie, post No Time to Die, Daniel Craig. And it follows this old, long, little trope pattern that has existed since the 1960s. Actors who were either let go from the project of playing James Bond, or actors who turned down the role and later came back to be in the role. People often forget this, but, and I'll be as quick as I can because we're at 10 minutes and 8 seconds. Roger Moore was originally considered for James Bond, turned down the role due to other projects. Sean Connery played James Bond. After George Lazenby only did one movie and Connery came back, Roger Moore's contract making The Saint was over, and he took over the role of James Bond. But what's more interesting is Timothy Dalton was asked in 1967 to replace Sean Connery as James Bond, and turned it down because he thought he was too young to play the role. Fast forward to 1986. He's asked again, and he decides to take the role on and becomes the next James Bond due to Pierce Brosnan. He was originally going to replace Roger Moore, was tied up with a contract clause for Remington Steele. When his obligation was over and he downright turned down the role because he wanted to play James Bond 5 more times, Pierce Brosnan took over for Timothy Dalton. Now this is where Dougray Scott comes in, as well as Henry Cavill, the two main candidates to play James Bond. Both Dougray Scott and Henry Cavill actually were casted as James Bond. Dougray Scott in 2005 was casted as James Bond, and then they let him go when they decided to give the role to Henry Cavill, who actually started principal photography on the film. Was told by a director that he was too young and too overweight to play the role of James Bond, in which they sold on Daniel Craig, and the rest is history. So obviously Henry Cavill, because Dougray Scott is probably too old to play Bond now, but you never know. Now let's go on to quality real quick. Much like Mission Impossible in 4K, the 4K in this one is spectacular. Those colors really come out. This is very HDR10 heavy. The Dolby True HD sound technology outdoes all the Dolby Digital sound presentation that you had on the DVD in the Blu-ray. So if you have not checked out Mission Impossible 2, check it out, and I'll see you on the next one.